Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, here in Westminster, Justine Greening has become the first former Cabinet Minister to call for a second Brexit referendum. She says Parliament is gridlocked. Ms Greening, who served as Education Secretary, said MPs clearly can't take Brexit forward.
I think Brexit has to be above party politics, and what needs to come first is not any political party, but what's right for the country. We need to recognise that Parliament is now stalemated on a way forward on Brexit. If it's the Prime Minister's deal, I believe that will not be supported and it will be voted down. If it's a proposal on a no deal, that will be voted down. All Parliament can do is block a route forward. And I think if that's the case and that's the reality, then the only way we can find a path forward is to go back to the British people and ask them to take the decision. I think they need to choose between, in practice, the three alternative routes we have. One is a soft Brexit, that's the Prime Minister's deal. One is a proper clean break, which is a hard Brexit, and I think listening to the Leave voters in my own community, that's what they want. They wanted a clean break from the European Union. Or, of course, the third route is that we could stay in the European Union. I'm saying those are the three paths forward for our country in practice. People should be allowed to choose between them. And the way they should do that is to have two votes. They can vote for their first choice, and then they can vote for the option going forward that if they don't get the first choice is the next best one for them. It's how we elect mayors around the country, and I think it gives us the best chance of finding, finally, some consensus for the British people on a route forward on Brexit.
It's a busy Brexit week ahead for the Prime Minister and the government. A tough start as the Brexit customs bill returns to the Commons for its final reading, with the government uncertain it's got enough votes to pass it. That's followed tomorrow by the trade bill, which provides the framework for Britain's international trade after Brexit. Then it's a packed day on Wednesday. At lunchtime, it's the Prime Minister's final Prime Minister's questions before the summer recess, followed by an appearance for Mrs May before the liaison committee. And later on Wednesday, she'll get a sense of how backbench Tories are feeling towards her when she addresses the 1922 committee. And on top of all that, there are reports that the former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson may give a resignation speech this week, as could possibly David Davis. Well, speaking as he headed to work this morning, the former Brexit Secretary, Mr Davis, said what he was expecting of the coming week.
Oh, a business-like one. I've got two bills to debate today and tomorrow, and I should be doing my new job of being an ordinary backbencher.
And are you going to say anything to the House when you make a resignation speech?
No, no. My name's not Geoffrey Howe.
And do you think that the Prime Minister can survive another week?
Of course. She's a good Prime Minister. The fact we have a difference of opinion doesn't change that.
And I presume the way you'll be voting today goes without saying?
I'll be supporting the government on the bill and on the customs union elements where there's a challenge to them. But I'll also probably support one of the amendments on ensuring that Northern Ireland is not separated from Great Britain, which is in any event government policy, but would do no harm putting it into the bill.
Do you regret resigning?
No, not for a moment.
Well, joining me now is the Labour MP, Hilary Benn. He's the chair of the Commons Brexit Committee, scrutinising the government's actions.
Morning, Adam.
Good morning to you, yes. Mr Benn, do you think that Justine Greening's got the answer there? Have another referendum with three possible options?
I don't think so. Because first of all, I don't think you can reduce this to a multiple-choice questionnaire referendum. And secondly, Parliament hasn't yet had the chance to vote on a deal because we don't have a deal. All that happened in Chequers the Friday before last is the Prime Minister patched something together to try and bring her warring cabinet together, but as we've just been seeing, with David Davis being interviewed walking along the road, that fell apart, and there doesn't seem to be a majority in the House of Commons for it. But secondly, and absolutely crucially, We don't have an agreement with the European Union. We haven't even heard from the European Union what they think of the proposals that the Prime Minister has put forward. Now, the crucial vote, the really important moment, will be in the autumn at some point, if a deal comes back, where Parliament will have to decide.
Do you think you are going to get a deal, though? Because, I mean, what's remarkable about the Chequers agreement is that, yes, it's been attacked by the William Rees-Moggs and Boris Johnsons of this world, also been attacked by the Justine Greenings and some of the most ardent pro-Europeans.
Well, I think that just reveals the complexity of the politics surrounding Brexit. But look, in our most recent Select Committee report, we said it was important when we get to that moment, the government will put forward a motion, assuming there is an agreement reached with the EU that will say that this House approves the withdrawal agreement. And we said it's important that a number of amendments can be considered by the Speaker and then put to the House, because it's about trying to find a consensus in Parliament as to what is sensible. So you'd have that
multiple choice question in Parliament, effectively.
Well, what Parliament might either say, yep, that's fine, off you go, or Parliament could say, we decline to give approval to the withdrawal agreement, but for different reasons. And so from my point of view, if it doesn't include provision for the UK to remain in a customs union, which would be a much simpler and easier way of achieving the frictionless trade that the Prime Minister has spoken about, and which just about everybody wants to see.
On television.
Well, I know. Well, I think that is a profound mistake, because what she's come up with is a complex arrangement that will be expensive and bureaucratic for business, and it's not entirely clear that the European Union will agree to it. Now, what is she going to do if they come back and say, well, that's all very well, Prime Minister, but that isn't going to work? And she needs to start listening to what I think is a majority in the House of Commons.
I mean, putting it crudely, do you think she is strong enough, and the government is strong enough, to carry on with this negotiating process with Ollie Robbins and Dominic Raab and all the others through the summer to actually come back to Parliament?
Well, they're having a very difficult time of it. Look, I hope we have a general election, we have a change of government. But I think she's going to try and hang on as long as she can. But in the end, she's going to have to put a proposition to Parliament that can command a majority. And I don't think what she has proposed, not been agreed yet, but proposed, would do that.
What about this week's votes? We've got the Conservative European Research Group putting the threateners on. Do you think they're likely to succeed?
I don't think so, because what you might describe as wrecking amendments that they have put down are not going to, I think, command a majority in the House of Commons. The crucial question is, would they be prepared to vote down the bills at third reading? I'm not sure about that, because in the case of the trade bill, it is supposedly about preparing the way for Britain to negotiate trade deals with the rest of the world. So I suspect what we'll see after the next 2 days is a good indication of the number of them who feel sufficiently strongly to vote against their government in support of these wrecking amendments.
Now, latest immigration figures out this morning show that immigration from the European Union is down to a 5-year low of over 100,000. The immigration overall is also down. I mean, a lot of people would say, well, that's what we voted for with Brexit, wouldn't they?
Well, that's the result of decisions that individuals have taken, and there's no doubt that Brexit, I think, has had some effect. Look, I think people voted to have some control. And what outcome would I like to see? I'd like to see us staying in a customs union. I'd like to take the EEA, European Economic Area framework, but to negotiate some changes in relation to free movement. You would have freedom of movement of labour, wouldn't you? Well, I think we would seek to negotiate some changes. There are two things that we can do as a country. One is we can apply free movement in a different way. We've operated the most liberal, open system, and you could operate a system, as in Belgium, for example, where you have to register when you start to work. And secondly, there is a clause in the EEA agreement about what they call an emergency break. I think we should talk to the European Union about that. At least that would be a framework that the European Union would recognise. I think the problem with the Prime Minister's proposals that she has got the Cabinet, well, most of the Cabinet's agreement to, is I think they'll look at it and say, I don't think that we can see how this is going to work.
Do you welcome, though, that immigration has dropped?
Well, that's the decision that people have taken. There's a balance to be struck here, Adam. There is a balance to be struck. Because I met lots of people in the referendum who voted leave who said, look, we're not asking for immigration to end because we recognise the needs of industry, the skills we require in addition to those that are homegrown, but we want to have some control. Now, I think it shows that within the current system, you could see higher figures and lower figures, and we will, in the end, have to agree a deal with the EU and our own new immigration system. But I think most people recognise we're going to need a combination of what we contribute from this great country and also the skills that people bring in from outside, whether it's picking fruit and vegetables, doing advanced heart surgery, or providing social care as we have a growing elderly population.
OK, Hilary Benn, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
With us for the whole of the programme today is the Labour MP, Lucy Powell, Conservative MP and Brexit Minister Suella Braverman, and Steve Hawkes, Deputy Political Editor of The Sun. And for the top half of the show, we're also joined by the former Education Secretary, Justine Greening. She's broken cover today to call for a second referendum. We'll talk about all of that in just a moment. But first, let's just take a look at this.
The whole country wants to know, Prime Minister, what was that brutal, tough suggestion?
He told me I should sue the EU.
Sue the EU?
Sue the EU. Not go into negotiations, sue them. Actually, no.
Did you think about that for a second?
We're going into negotiations with them. But interestingly, what the President also said at that press conference was don't walk away.
Yeah.
Don't walk away from the negotiations because then you're stuck.
So that was the advice from Donald Trump to Theresa May. Yes, we all wanted to know what it was. What did you make of the fact that he said to Theresa May, sue the EU?
Well, I reverted to type. I was formerly a lawyer. And your first question when a client comes to you as a lawyer and says, I want to sue this guy, is you say, well, what's your cause of action? What's the civil wrong? What's the breach of contract? And what's the damage that's been caused here? And where are you going to bring this? Which court? And I don't think any of those basic questions can be answered on Donald Trump's advice.
I like the way you engage, though, Suella, at the level of it being a possibility. I mean, what do you think he was thinking in terms of what was he going to sue the EU for?
Well, that's exactly the question. What would be the cause of action? What is the breach of contract? Where is the wrong? That's a fundamental basis for any legal action or suing.
Right. It was quite a good look, though, for the Prime Minister in the sense that she obviously didn't take that advice, and a little bit of revenge and deflection tactic on Andrew Marr's show yesterday by announcing and revealing what he'd said to her.
It was, actually. But, I mean, look, I think she's very wise to not take diplomacy advice from Donald Trump, really, isn't he? I mean, he's just absolutely ripped up the rule book when it comes to diplomacy, and it's not getting him very far, really, is it? We're engaged in sort of trade wars, and now he's even looking like a bit of a sycophant to Putin. So I think she was very well wise to ignore that advice.
What do you imagine she was like when she first heard those words, Steve, sitting there?
It was interesting yesterday. You saw that was a huge release for Theresa May because she'd been challenged over her own Brexit mess for a good 20 minutes, and that enabled her just to release some pressure. I think it was more about at the start of negotiations, Donald Trump said, look, my suggestion is just walk away and let them sue you. I think that's what he meant. But of course it came out a bit garbled. But you could see that she was you could see from her reaction laughing about it that she was gently also mocking him back, which was good for her to do after everything from last week.
Was it a release for her?
Oh, I don't know if it was a release, but obviously she was right not to take the suggestion that seriously.
Yeah, well, that's fair enough. Justine, let's talk about the Chequers proposal, because, of course, that is what came out last week. What's wrong with it?
I'd hope we could get a workable compromise, but I think this is a compromise that doesn't seem to work for anyone. Whether you're a Leaver who just feels this is not what you voted for, many of them have been in touch with me from my own local area, whether you're a Remainer sat there thinking, well, if we're going to be having all these rules, we might as well be sat around the table. It just doesn't seem to work for anyone. And my sense looking through the white paper is that in practice it will be unworkable, and that Parliament will find it hard to make sure that any rule book stays updated, and that probably the times when Parliament finds it most hard are going to be times like the one we're in now, where we have a minority government. So it will pile political instability on top of instability, and that's the last thing this country needs.
All right, let's have a look at some of the quotes in the article today from you in The Times. We can have a look at the words that you use. The deal is a fudge I can't support. It's the worst of both worlds. You know, pretty strong sentiment there. Let's go on and see what you say further down in the article, which is still talking about the Chequers proposal. The only solution is to take the final Brexit decision out of the hands of deadlocked politicians, away from the backroom deals, and give it back to the people. What made you think about a second referendum?
Because Parliament literally cannot vote for any outcome on Brexit. All it can do is vote outcomes down. So Parliament will not support, I believe, the Prime Minister's deal. Parliament will not support, equally, a no-deal scenario. And in that case, Parliament is stalemated. I think the worst thing to do is just to put your head in the sand, hope it'll all be OK when it won't be. And therefore, if that's correct, and that is actually the reality, I think most MPs probably recognise what I'm saying, then you have to say, well, how do we nevertheless move forward? You can't just not go anywhere as a country. And the only way you can do that is then to give that decision back to the British people.
Right, well, Suella, you're obviously in charge of this proposal to some extent as a minister in the Brexit department. It's unworkable, it's a fudge, it's the worst of all worlds. What do you say in response?
Well, the Chequers paper has received the collective agreement from the Cabinet, and it's now the policies as we step into the next phase of the negotiations. I really empathise with colleagues who have got concerns, but I do believe that it honours the referendum result, ultimately on a balancing of the pros and cons. It stops free movement of people. It takes us out of the common agricultural policy, the fisheries policy. It will allow the end of direct effect of EU law, the end of the supremacy of EU law, fundamental principles about how our country is currently governed. It will allow us to step out of the common foreign and security policy and the justice and home affairs pillars. Again, integral aspects of our membership of the EU. And I believe that, yes, this is a compromise and it's one that I can live with.
Right. Why can't you live with it?
I think it's Brexiteers who won't live with it. And I think this is part of the problem. Although it's very clever and very well-intentioned, I don't think it's workable, but I think it won't last. And I think what you'll find is people trying to unpick it in the coming years. And what we need in our country is to find a resolution to this. I don't think we need more time. We know what the issues are on Brexit. We know what some of the trade-offs are. But the bottom line is we now need to take a decision. I'm saying Parliament is no longer in a position to do that. I regret that. I'd hoped over the last 2 years we really would have been able to find some kind of a compromise and some kind of way through. I just don't think we can. And therefore we have to nevertheless succeed in the real world. I think that means a referendum to the British people. And I've got another problem, actually, which is even if we had a free vote, and I'm not expecting us to get a free vote on a final deal, I know that I would be disenfranchising thousands of people in my local community. And I just think on something this important that is going to affect all our lives for decades to come, that's not acceptable. And I think we have to also recognise there's a democratic deficit here. That means we've got to go back to the people for them to have their say on the final Brexit outcome. And Joe, the final point I'd like to make is this country faces a lot of challenges. And whilst we spend our time focused on Brexit, trying to work out what the way through is, we don't get onto the broader ones, whether it's social care, looking after the most vulnerable people in our society, whether it's social mobility, the lack of equality of opportunity, whether it's the housing crisis. We have to now draw a line under the approach on Brexit so we can get onto that. But the only people who can now do that is the British public.
But
Justine, I mean, I have to fundamentally disagree with you on the proposal for a second referendum. I think we had a very high turnout in 2016, a very active and vocal campaign on both sides, divisive to an extent. At the general election last year, 80% of voters supported parties that were honouring the referendum result. And I don't think that people really want to rerun arguments. They want government to now get on with the job. There is a meaningful vote in Parliament, and I believe it's democratic and it's the right thing to do to just deliver this, not go back over the arguments.
But Justine, you've demolished the Prime Minister's position, this Chequers proposal. You've said it's unworkable and it is the worst of all worlds. And yet last week you defended the Prime Minister's position and you actually said we shouldn't continue arguing for the sake of arguing. You said it on 5 Live. Let's have a listen.
I think she's come forward with a genuinely workable plan, something that can be the foundation for a deal.
You like the Chequers compromise, let's call it that, the Chequers compromise as it sits, and you're ready to contemplate further concessions along the line for the sake of getting a deal. I think it's a sensible proposal that should be taken seriously, and what I think needs to stop in British politics is arguing for the sake of arguing. We now really need to stick together as a party, get behind the Prime Minister and try and make sure that we support her as she goes through what are going to be monumentally difficult negotiations with the EU.
And you've undermined that position. What changed between then and now?
Well, it's clear that if Brexiteers are not able to support this, then it isn't a workable plan. And when you start to look at the detail of the white paper, it isn't something that I believe can persist and succeed in Parliament going forward. Now, I can either take a decision and say, well, because I'd wanted it to work, and it's now clear that it can't, that somehow I should not speak out. But I think we have to. And when I talk about arguing for the sake of arguing, I'm talking about Parliament. I'm talking about the fact that just before my interview, we'd heard from a Labour politician representing the Labour Party who's just trying to pick holes in it because that was her job. My point is, Parliament's argued for long enough on this. Now it needs to go to the British people.
Right, but it hadn't actually, this proposal hadn't gone yet to Parliament, so you don't know that it wouldn't have worked. But it's true, 9 people have resigned over this. Is the Labour Party position, should it change, Lucy Powell? Because it hasn't been ruled out, this idea of Labour supporting a second referendum. Should the Labour Party seriously consider this?
Personally, I don't think so. I mean, I totally respect Justine and others who are calling for it. But I think if the last few years have taught me anything, it's that very complex issues, as the Queen has, as we found out, has said about Brexit, you know, very complex issues do not take well to referenda. You get outcomes that you don't want, that are taken over by the zeitgeist of the moment or whatever else. And it's, I mean, I hear what Justine is saying, but frankly, we are all paid a lot of money to take these decisions and to come to compromises and to see through these difficult issues. And where I would agree completely with Justine is that we do have to set aside some of our own personal ideology, some of our own personal views, and actually make this happen, because as Justine said, you know, in the meantime, what is happening are people are actually losing their jobs right now as businesses are taking different decisions, and the country as a whole is losing for this indecision. And, you know, the government do have to take some responsibility for this too. I mean, we're 2 years now down this track, and we've just come up with this first sort of proposal on the table, and it's not just the government, but it's the Brexiteers as well. Where were their ideas about what Brexit actually meant?
Right, but on that, why isn't the Labour Party supporting this proposal then? If it's deemed a compromise and you say you've had long enough, government and Parliament's had long enough, will you back the proposal?
Well, we have said that we think there should be a more comprehensive sort of customs arrangement than what is in this current proposal. And we also think that services need to be included as well. Now, that's not to say that when it comes to the rubber hitting the road at some point in the future, that some of us, or the Labour Party as a whole, I don't know, might rather support some kind of deal rather than no deal. I'm sure that some of us may. But, you know, let's kind of have those discussions rather than leaving it so late in the day as this, that we've lost all this time.
Well, Steve, a couple of things. I mean, listening to Lucy there, it sounds as if a lot of Labour MPs would rather support this proposal than a no deal. And listening to Justine calling for a second referendum, I mean, should anyone listen to her in government?
Well, people should listen to Justine. She's very good, and she's a loss to the front bench in my mind. It's just, I think the timing is fascinating. You know, it seems as though basically you've got the remaining. It's fascinating watching what Lucy must be thinking. Labour 2 years ago was going through exactly this. Now Labour look unified. You know, Labour, the party where 100 people resigned from Jeremy Corbyn's, you know, shadow cabinet, look unified, with the Conservatives going through this.
I don't know how you can say Labour are unified. We had a vote
a few weeks ago
when there was a 3-way split on Labour's side, supporting the EEA, against the EEA and abstaining. And actually, in the EU withdrawal bill debates, it was actually the Labour Party that was all over the place.
Suella, you were shepherded up a road in Whitehall the other day by the head of comms as your colleague resigned. I mean, there's resignations every day. You've got, and it now looks as though, I think I'm interested with Justine's timing on this. It seems as though the Brexiteers are causing trouble, so the pro-EU Remain camp put one over the top.
I think what I'm saying is actually that Brexit is not a party political issue, and yet Westminster runs on party political lines. So in a way, it's not being able to cope with and deal with the Brexit challenge. And that's partly why we're in this problem today, because we have a Labour Party that will always generally oppose. But then within the Tory party, because this is not party political lines, splits on Brexit, which are totally understandable. And actually Parliament hasn't been able to cope with that. What I'm saying is we should stop putting our heads in the sand and expecting that to change. Start realising that as of March next year, we will be heading quickly towards quite possibly a no-deal outcome that I believe Parliament would have a vote on and say it didn't want. and we need to get ahead of what that would give us, which is a real crisis.
One of the options in your proposal for the second referendum is that we should remain in the EU, in your article. And, I mean, that would be a complete contradiction with a binding mandate that was carried out in 2016 when 17.4 million people voted to leave. And that's where, again, asking the people again, rerunning the arguments, would only cause more delay and more confusion.
But Leavers clearly don't believe that the Chequers deal is delivering on what they voted for. And I just think you're not going to get a resolution to this that's sustainable if you come forward with a version of Brexit that they can't accept. And I completely understand where they're coming from as well. So I'm saying the only way you get through this is to recognise all of that, accept it, and then deal with it.
But how much support? How much public and political support is there for a second referendum? I mean, yes, the SNP, Liberal Democrats, some Labour MPs. How much support within your own party?
I suspect there are a large number of Tory MPs who are realising that this is actually the best way through this impasse. Parliament is at an impasse. We will easily get, I think, to the end of the year and the PM comes back with a deal that Parliament can't support. I think we could easily end up with a position where she might even say, look, I always said no deal was better than a bad deal. They've watered down my Chequers proposal, so it's no deal. Parliament, I don't think, will be able to support that. Now, we either get prepared or we just canter towards that moment and then have no plan.
Right. I mean, it is true. 9 resignations over this Chequers proposal, including 2 cabinet resignations. We've just had 2 more resignations. You may say, well, who are these MPs? But they are MPs on the payroll. There they are, Scott Mann and Robert Courts. Robert Courts taking over for David Cameron in his constituency, and Scott Mann, a Treasury PPS, Private Parliamentary Secretary. So that brings the total to 9. Justine is right. It's unravelling. Brexiteers can't support this. You were a Brexiteer when you voted in the referendum, and you're still a Brexiteer. So you say you empathise with them. Is it going to unravel? You're not going to get the supporters from Brexit on this.
I don't think so. I think we've got to... I mean, as everyone's highlighted, there are strong views on both sides of the debate in both parties. And that's inevitable on such a big issue like this. It is complex. And I'm an enthusiastic Brexiteer. I was in 2016. I still am. I'm very optimistic about our prospects out of the EU. I believe that this is all about a difference in how much people want to compromise. And as I said, this is a compromise. I'm going to be straightforward about that. And it's about weighing up the compromises with the advantages.
And is that what you went through? I mean, Steve mentions your position last week. When David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, resigned, followed by Steve Baker, your then colleague, in the department, did you consider resigning?
I didn't resign. I mean, there was a lot of...
Did you consider resigning?
There was a lot of news about me allegedly resigning. A very good example, to quote the American president, of fake news. But I didn't resign. And I didn't resign because I'm supporting the position of the government. I'm supporting the Prime Minister, and I want to deliver a really good Brexit.
But did you at any point consider leaving your job in government?
Well, I think when your Secretary of State, David Davis, with whom I've worked very closely, and Steve Baker make a really important decision about their careers for very personal reasons, you don't just carry on in oblivion to that happening. Of course, you look around you and you see what's happening. But at the end of the day, I'm very confident in the programme that we've adopted. It is a compromise, and I believe that we've got to move forward as a united party and a united country.
Right. Well, I mean, let's have a look at the pictures. You referred to Suella being what looks like strong-armed. I think.
No, I wasn't actually being strong-armed.
So what was going on there? We saw pictures of you with the Director of Communications, and he did seem to be escorting you up or down Whitehall. What was going on?
Well, I was just leaving Downing Street to go to Parliament for a meeting, and he was accompanying me, and we had a meeting, and we were talking about what was happening.
Was there a worry that you might resign?
No, I don't think so. As I said, I didn't resign, and I'm very glad that to be in this position. It's a challenging time for all of us. I have a lot of confidence in the Prime Minister and the government to deliver this. This is about honouring the referendum. It's about moving forward the negotiations. Lucy said, why has it taken so long? I have to say, it's not the UK's fault. It was the EU that insisted that we have a sequencing of issues, deal with the phase 1 issues, and only once we've dealt with those...
But you signed up to that.
Start talking... Yeah, absolutely. But don't say, oh, this is the UK government government's fault for coming up with this so late. This is really
this is your position.
Timetable.
No, this isn't about why the negotiations have taken so long. This is your position to enter the negotiations. That's taken 2 years, 2 wasted years. And part of this is, and this is partly why I don't want a second referendum, is that, you know, people were sold a pup. They were told that there would be this panacea of all these trade deals being lined up all around the world, and would be great for us outside the EU. I can't see the queues of people. I can't see the queues of.
Why wouldn't you think that was important to go back and allow them a final say?
It's not about a final say. We've had a referendum and there was a clear view.
You said they were sold apart.
Yeah, but I'm not going to go back and say I thought you were wrong and I was right.
I've got to
make the best of what we've got.
My view is, I think on something this important, if this is a compromise that the British people want, they should have the chance to validate that. I cannot see why on something as significant and generational as Brexit, that we will all have to live with for several decades, that anyone could say that the British people watching this programme shouldn't have the chance to vote for the
because I think we will see further grievance politics at play.
But grievance comes from people not having a say.
As we've seen sweeping through, people will be told that this is all the EU's fault, that we've had this impasse and so on and so forth, and that we've got this panacea waiting for us of all these trade deals.
And won't they be angry when they don't get a chance to feel like they had to have a say?
I think that will be a generational thing. I think at some point we will have another referendum, but not in this generation.
Justine, what happens if they vote for a clean break?
I think then we've absolutely clarified what the version of Brexit was that people want.
But you would have then gone from a compromise where we're mirroring the EU on goods, which I believe...
This is a matter for the British public.
Sure, but if they vote for a clean break, your grouping in the Tory party would be aghast at that compared with where we are now.
I think you have to go and find out what the British public now think. I think when we had the referendum, we obviously knew what the Remain deal was, but genuinely, it wasn't clear what the basis on which leave would happen was, as Lucy's just said. I think we now know, though, what the clear options are. There's a soft form of Brexit that tries to form a compromise. I think in the end it's the worst of all worlds. We also, though, know...
Worse than a clean break?
Well, I think quite possibly, yes, because I think in the end you're going to end up with a halfway house that suits no one, and it's not going to be sustainable. And as I said, I think you need to...
Ultimately, I don't think Brenda from Bristol, if we were to ask her whether she wanted to go over this all again, I don't think she'd be in favour of this. And I think that reflects the vast majority of British people.
But it is about honesty, isn't it? And transparency and holding principles dear in the way that some people would argue David Davis and Steve Baker did. I mean, did you, Suella, talk to the Sky reporter Lewis Goodall and say that you would be resigning in the morning after David Davis had handed in his resignation?
No.
You didn't?
Not at all.
You categorically
I'd love to see some proof of that conversation. That never happened. I didn't resign, and I didn't tell anyone.
Well, we know you didn't resign, but it was about whether you considered resigning, because, as you know, your former boss David Davis is writing in the FT today and says that continued harmonisation on goods with the EU jeopardises the opportunities offered by Brexit. Is he wrong?
Well, you'll have to ask David Davis about his opinion on various things. As I said, what we've arranged, what we've put out in the Chequers paper is to harmonise on our regulations relating to goods. That is for 20% of our economy. The vast majority of our economy is services, and those regulations will be free of EU coverage. And that gives us a great opportunity when it comes to trade deals. When it comes to these regulations on goods, we've got a referral mechanism whereby if the EU wants to apply a new rule or we want to diverge from a rule, there is a whole set of procedures whereby ultimately Parliament has the say on whether to accept or reject. And I think that's a very different basis to the way EU rules and regulations are applied today.
But neither Steve Baker nor David Davis could sign up to that. And in fact, as you know, Steve Baker said there was a Potemkin structure to sort of provide a veneer of some sort of capability for the UK. He said he was blindsided. They weren't expecting the proposal on a common rule book. When did you know that there were discussions on a common rule book with the EU?
Well, as you know, DEXU has a role of coordinating Whitehalls and various government preparations for Brexit, and that's our role. And I really enjoyed working with David and Steve in that role. We're now following the proposal, which is subject to cabinet responsibility, and that's what we all are. That's what the position of the government is.
All right. Well, let's talk to Norman Smith, the BBC's assistant political editor, to talk about what's going on in the Commons today, because the Brexit proposals of the government will be scrutinised this afternoon. What's going on, Norman?
Short answer, a government climb down looms, I think, because all the signs are that the government will accept perhaps all of the amendments put down by the ERG group. Why? Because they feared, frankly, if they didn't, that the ERG might join forces with Labour to vote down the whole legislation, which Team May fear would lead to a potentially catastrophic and disorderly Brexit if we didn't have any control over our customs arrangement. In the near term, for the Brexiteers, it suggests that their desire, if you like, to have a show of strength has worked. They have, in effect, kicked sand in Mrs May's face just to show they can do it, and they put a marker down that they have the numbers to defeat her if necessary, or certainly to cause her grief. On the other hand, for Tory Remainers, they are now up in arms because they say, well, you didn't do that when Dominic Grieve tried to get you to change course, and they firmly believe that Mrs May has buckled in the face of this threat from Tory Brexiteers.
Just stay with us for a moment. Steve, what do you say to that? It seems to underline what Justine Greening has been saying.
It underlines that huge tug of war between the Remain camp and the Brexit camp, and then so everywhere she turns, she's got pressure on both sides. And we heard about this compromise yesterday. The fatal flaw in this is if they accept all four of them, Jacob Rees-Mogg and the ERG really believe they've made a mistake in kicking the can down the road, because the Fourth Amendment, which demands reciprocity on tariffs, is going to cause them a huge problem. But they believe, the government now, if it had insisted on putting these to the vote, there would have been more resignations this afternoon.
Right.
So they're kicking the can down the road, but now they've got a huge problem in the autumn, how they get reciprocity out of the bill.
Well, Norman, just sort of explain a bit more broadly exactly what that means in terms of collecting tariffs on behalf of the EU at what would be the borders, unless there is some sort of reciprocal arrangement with the EU doing the same for us.
Well, I think the point is, it is that Fourth Amendment which is the crucial one. The other ones you can see the government sort of accepting, i.e. no border in the Irish Sea, being able to diverge on VAT, those sort of things are okay. It's basically about getting through tonight. Everything has become so fraught, so difficult in the survival game. It's just getting through the next 24 hours. And if that means signing up to this Fourth Amendment, under which we would collect EU tariffs, provided the EU thought about doing the same, even though there's no prospect, as far as I can see, of the EU signing up to that. Doesn't matter, gets you through today, gets you through a few more weeks, gets you into recess. Who knows what the situation will be like a few weeks down the road. It's just trying to keep it rolling along because there is no other strategy, and it is basically about survival almost from day to day, week to week.
Well, Norman, we have to let Justine Greening go in a minute. Before you go, can Theresa May survive this? Because you have said it's not going to survive the Brexiteers. That does seem to be, to some extent, strengthened by what we've just heard now. Can she keep going?
I think she can. I think the issue I'm pointing out is Parliament's reached an impasse, as Norman has just set out. And what we shouldn't do is just ignore that and hope it's all going to be fine. The British people need a clear direction on Brexit. I think it's clear to me, and Norman's piece underlines this, that only they can now provide that direction.
But can she lead? I mean, can she lead this situation, Theresa May?
I think what she should be focused on is taking the deal that she's got to Brussels, getting the best version of that. I fully expect it may be watered down, unfortunately, in some areas, but then that will provide us with the basis of these three choices that I think should be put to the British people.
All right, Justine Greening, thank you very much for joining us. Norman, just finally, you've talked about survival. I mean, if she does get through the next few weeks and into the summer recess, it will be in the autumn, won't it, that the focus will be on the meaningful vote?
I think crunch for Mrs May, yes, is in the autumn, and I think this is going to play out in terms of the May plan. If the May plan goes down in the autumn, then I can't honestly see how Mrs May can continue, because she's pretty much ruled out any alternative strategy, saying, in effect, this is as good as it gets, this is the hard-headed, realistic, pragmatic option. There isn't another option. If the Brexiteers manage to force another strategy on her, I don't see credibly how she can lead or negotiate that strategy. So it seems to me her fate is now inextricably bound up with her Brexit plan. And if that falls apart, then I would suggest a premiership is probably over.
Norman, thank you very much for joining us. Suella, this is a government climb down.
Well, I think, as we're seeing, you know, with all pieces of legislation, there is a dialogue process. That's the whole point of parliamentary scrutiny.
But the government's just signed up to every single amendment from Brexiteer Tories.
Right, well, I'm not aware of what's been happening in the last hour or so.
Do you think that's not going to happen?
I don't know, but I trust what Norman Smith is saying on the BBC. This is all about dialogue with our backbenchers and ensuring that ultimately we get a really good product in the form of legislation that Parliament can sign up to as a majority. And that inevitably involves talking and discussing proposals.
Lucy?
Well, I mean, you know, she should have just continued what she was doing and faced down her Brexiteers. You can't keep switching which way you're facing on
well, except she's surviving, though, isn't she?
It took her so long to get to this point of producing a white paper, what the government's position was before we even go to the EU. You've just got to kind of face that down, and I do think she's now got to look at building a more national consensus on this, rather than just trying to build a consensus in her own party, which clearly is impossible to do, as it's always been impossible to do within the Tory party on Europe for 30 years.
I think that's the case about, you mentioned earlier, leadership and head in the sand. I think what a lot of people, I know Justine and the pro-EU Tories would like is leadership, and someone to, you know, ironically the Remain is saying, I'll stare down the Brexiteers, like she didn't stare down them with Dominic Grieve amendment. But I think the nation would quite like Theresa May to actually stand up, not beat Donald Trump, but stand up and actually show some leadership, and even a national address to say, this is our plan, this is why it's going to work, this is why we're compromising, and explain to the nation a bit. Try and get someone on side, because there's this vacuum and everyone's infighting. It's like the parents have gone out and the kids are at home and they're scrapping, you know, and no one's actually leading anywhere.
I agree. Well, I disagree. I think we've set out a really comprehensive and detailed plan about our future relationship.
Your former colleagues don't like it. They're going to vote it down.
Well, I don't know about that. Let's see how it goes. This is about the beginning of the negotiations. The ball is now very firmly in the EU's court, and it's about them responding in kind with a pragmatic and flexible and generous approach.
Right, and Theresa May has said that her Chequers deal has a set of outcomes that are non-negotiable. How would you feel if more concessions are necessary in order for the EU to agree to the plan?
Well, again, we are right at the beginning of the negotiations. I'm not directly involved in them. I'm not going to prejudge and answer speculative questions.
Right.
We have to. I want the EU to come forward with some negotiations, the options.
So you're prepared to concede?
No, I'm prepared to look at what the EU comes back with. That's what a negotiation involves. The proposals they've put forward so far, EEA plus a customs union, and a proposal that would involve a hard border or a border down the Irish Sea, are totally unacceptable. And therefore, we need to dialogue. We need to talk about what can work for both of us.
All right, just before we move on, I should tell you that Justine Greening, the former Education Secretary, has left the studio. We've been joined instead by Tim Marshall. Delighted to have you here, Foreign Affairs analyst, because we're going to talk about all things Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
Oh, I was just thinking when I watched the last half hour, this is why Donald Trump said that the easiest part of his foreign voyage would be the Putin role. It's just been underlined by the last half hour.
You mean to say Donald Trump has said something rather prescient then when it comes to foreign affairs and diplomacy?